Peggy Noonan, author of What I Saw at the Revolution of Political Life in the Reagan Era, you write at the middle of your second epilogue, at the back, "Don't fall in love with politicians. They are all a disappointment. They can't help it. They just are." What did you mean?
Oh, I meant when you are young and you come to Washington to work for someone, a senator, a congressman, a president, an agency head, who you think is just wonderful and magical, perhaps going in with those presuppositions because you've read a little bit too much history, maybe too many celebrations in history, like biographies of Lincoln by Sandberg. You go in with some big notions and you just love them and you want to help them, you kind of fall in love, and at the end you realize they're just regular guys. They got clay feet. One of the things I wish I'd put afterwards was, another thing I found out working in Washington is that everybody's nervous. You wouldn't think an anchor man, a president, a senator, that all these folks are nervous, but they all are. They're as nervous as a secretary on her way to work for, looking for a new job, you know? They're regular, they're human.
Here's what the book looks like. How do you see them being nervous?
You know, the little, the insecurities that sort of come out. You would think when a person is awfully powerful that they wouldn't pay so much attention to little knocks in the press, but you know they do, and they not only do, they get a little hurt, you know. Sometimes they get so hurt they don't forget it and are mad at the reporter for 10 years. I can remember the night watching President Reagan give his farewell address. I watched in the Oval Office. And before he went on, when they were doing, as they just did here, the countdown, 10, 9, 8. Sucked in his breath, sort of went like this, put down his head, thought for a moment. I think he was saying a little prayer. He was scared. He was going on in front of the whole nation to talk to them all on TV. Now, you'd think Ronald Reagan couldn't possibly be scared. His lifetime has been talking to the nation on TV. But he's nervous. Dan Rather's nervous. They all are.
When have you been the most nervous in this book tour?
Actually, it was yesterday morning. Well, actually, I had two great nervous moments. One was before I did the Today Show. I'd never done live national TV. And I was so nervous that a producer had to walk through the halls with me at 3030 Rock and take me around from office to office, just parading me around so that I could burn off the nervousness. Because, you know, you have horrible fantasies. It's one thing to write for people who go across the nation on live TV, but it's quite another thing to be your own self, unscripted, and afraid perhaps that your tongue will get caught in your throat and you'll go like that on national TV and frighten your friends. So that was the most frightening moment, the Today Show, and the second most frightening was going on with bombastic Bushkin, John McLaughlin, yesterday up in New Jersey with his audience, and he has a cable show, and he had an audience full of people and a little panel of reporters questioning me, and I thought, oh, I'm not up to this. I'm new at this game, you know? So I was really nervous about it, but it went okay. I was a little dull, but...
Do you do anything, and I assume you've been nervous at other times in your life, do you think people do things differently when they're nervous?
Do you mean perform their job differently?
Yeah, are they better or worse?
Oh, good question. I think Dan Rather is better when he's nervous, when he doesn't know what's going to happen, so he's a performer who's better. I don't know with President Reagan. I think he always had a little stage fright before he went on. With President Bush, actually, I don't think nervous is quite the word, but when he knows it's high stakes and it better work, then he's at his best, I think. And I think he's likely to fall off a little bit when it's not that high stakes.
When you read your book, you see constant references throughout it to Dan Rather and Ronald Reagan, and I know that they both played a major role in your professional life. Yeah. Why the two men, and what do they have in common, if anything?
You know, the very fine Washington Post television essayist Tom Shales once wrote in the 80s when I was working for Reagan, a few years after I'd worked for Rather, he wrote in one of his columns that Rather and Reagan have a lot in common, which seemed an eccentric thing to say, but I was maybe the only person reading who had special experience with both of them and who thought, boy, is that true. They are both, Rather, for all his kind of perhaps stiff, perhaps cool, but perhaps also hot persona, is a very sentimental person. His emotions are close to the surface. I said in the book he is as corny and emotional about America as a drunken yaffer, you know? He has those moments.
Young
American for Freedom.
Member.
Yeah. President Reagan also had that easily accessed emotionalism and sweetness and pride about America, you know? So that was the biggest thing that I think they both had in common. It may seem a surprising thing.
What'd you do for Dan Rather?
Dan had a daily 5-minute radio show at CBS, on the CBS radio network, and I wrote it for him. Met with him every morning at 11 o'clock. Talked about what we were going to write and what the show was going to say. Had some disagreements and some real agreements. Worked for him for 3 years. Learned to like him a lot.
You do say in the book that he was a liberal. What kind of a liberal?
Yeah, he probably doesn't appreciate my saying that, but he's read it and he hasn't mentioned it to me. What kind of liberal? Largely a domestic liberal, I think. He has this sort of liberalish attitude towards, modern liberalish attitude towards government, which is sort of inherently, maybe almost compulsively skeptical about any presidential decision or initiative. Liberal and in sort of social issues, domestically more of a liberal. In international affairs, I don't think he trusts any other country. He's probably as compulsively skeptical about other countries and leaders as he is domestically about his own. He was a Marine, and he is a Texan, you know? So he's kind of an America guy. But his politics were different from mine, and in many regards. And when I had been writing for him for a few weeks, I finally went to him one day and I said, you know, you and I really do see things differently, and we're going to have to work out an M.O. in order to work successfully. Because I was freezing up a little bit as a writer, sometimes writing things I didn't agree with. So he was very nice. We had a little badinage in which we teased each other about being of the left and of the right. And ultimately, we worked out this thing whereby I would go in every morning at 11 o'clock, and he would tell me what topic he wanted to deal with in the commentary. And then he would tell me what point of view he wanted to take on it. And if I disagreed with him, I'd have 5 minutes to change his mind. And if I changed his mind, fine, we'd do it my way. If I could not change his mind, we would do it his way, but I would get to fairly portray the views of the other side in the piece, and then we'd just sort of wrap it up with Dan's conclusions. So that's how we did it for 3 years, and worked well.
How long did you work at CBS?
CBS in New York from 78 to 84. And before that, I was at a CBS station in Boston.
The last 11 years, actually 10 years for call-ins, we've sat here and listened to our audience. And there's a fair percentage of people who call in and accuse the networks of all being full of liberals. You had a chance to see it inside. Are those folks out there that are afraid of the networks being liberals accurate?
Yes and no. The networks are full of really good conservative folks, but they tend to be blue collars. They tend to be secretaries and technicians and the fellows who roll the cameras and check the audio levels. They tended to be regular working folks who lived out on, say, if we're talking about the networks based in New York, regular working folks who lived out on Long Island and had a wife and kids and were of a certain age and were heavily taxed on the margin, didn't love having high taxes. So that was half of CBS, half of the CBS I knew. The other folks at CBS, the sort of white-collar folks, the writers, the producers, the on-air talent, were, in my view, generally, not exclusively, liberal, but did not usually see themselves that way. They saw themselves, particularly the younger ones, as just decent people trying to be fair. They never called themselves liberals or conservatives. They usually didn't even have a party affiliation. Some of the older folks, older white collars at CBS were old-line Democrats and would tell you. The younger folks weren't, in their 30s and 40s. I always thought that though they did not see themselves as liberals and would not call themselves liberals, if you made out a list of great questions of the day and they had to take a stand on each of them, 5 questions from abortion to lowering taxes to raising taxes in order to rid ourselves of the deficit, what should our stance be towards the Soviet Union, they would most of them tend to take the generally liberal position. But would not think of themselves as that. They would just think, well, that's the right and decent and fair position. So that's how it was. So they're right and wrong. The good part is that I never saw anybody at CBS say, Reagan's making a speech tonight. Why, let's line up your standard liberal critics and knock the heck out of them when the speech is off. Or, you know, let's take the standard liberal view. So I never saw any of that awful stuff, and that just doesn't exist. And there is some conservative paranoia about that. But you know, if you generally tend to think with certain liberal biases, the way you cover a story will be affected by that. If Reagan says he is going to try to cut social services, your nice liberal feeling will be, then let's go out and get sound bites on the street from poor people who are going to be hurt, you know? Your bias would not be, well, let's get an economist who can discuss with us how making a smaller government might make lower taxes, which might rejuvenate the economy and create more jobs for poor people on the streets, you know? So bias was there. Most people did as much as they could to be fair.
Do the networks influence the public into thinking a certain way?
Well, I think TV in general does. I don't know, you know, I can't help but think a lot of people on my side, the conservative side, would say that we have had a pretty liberal media for the past 20 years. But oddly enough, we keep electing conservative presidents, don't we? So I guess the media are not controlling who we vote for, and they're not controlling our opinions on things. The television networks control the images you see and the words you hear, but I can't help but think that the American people, who are pretty savvy, pretty sophisticated, almost have, unknown to them, a cow dung screen between them and the television. You know what I mean? And they sort of filter out what they really think is the nonsense, and try to let filter in what they think is the truth.
Oh, I brought along a lot of reviews of your book, but I wanted to start, as I wanted to read you some of the stuff that I know you've already seen and get your reaction to it. I don't know, people who write books, I'm not sure they ever get a chance to respond to their reviewers. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about was, I think I could say without equivocation that your book has gotten, and the audience will see this in a minute, as much publicity, out front publicity, as any book that's ever been written in the last year. Would you say that? Maybe.
It's a heck of a lot. I can't make comparisons, but I'm stunned by the amount.
Let me start with this. This is one of those things that you see a lot on the East Coast. This is a New York Times magazine from last October, and it's a chapter, I believe a chapter or yes, more than that, from your book. Here it is, basically the cover of your book. How did that happen? This started it all. This is the first we saw of what you were going to write.
I think it made the book, actually. When I had finished one of the final drafts, I don't think quite the final draft, but one of the final drafts of the manuscript, Random House and my agent sent the entire manuscript off to a number of magazines so that the magazines could buy an excerpt. This is standard operating procedure. And you hope that a magazine will buy for almost any price. You're not really that interested in money at this point. You're interested in exposure. You hope that a magazine will buy a chapter, say, of the manuscript. We were very lucky. We were hoping the New York Times would take a chapter. Every few months the Times does take a chapter of the book. They took Thomas Friedman's From Beirut to Jerusalem, and so they bought a chapter from us, and we thought, well, terrific. That is just wonderful. It's the best thing that could possibly happen for the book. Then, within a few weeks, they told us, guess what? We want it to be the cover. And that was really stupendous. And and we were surprised and delighted. Then we had, I hope I'm not talking out of school to say this, I don't think I am, we had somewhat of a disagreement about the cover. The editor of the magazine, a very talented man named Jimmy Greenfield, had decided, having read this chapter, he was taken with the cartoon cutouts of President Reagan that you see on the streets in Washington. You still see Reagan ones, now you see Bush ones. You see Jesse Jackson, they're all over, but we remember when they were new. He wanted me to pose on the street between a Reagan and a Bush cutout. And I thought, oh, gee, that doesn't sound good. I don't think so. So we sort of tussled around about that a little bit. And we kind of thought we weren't going to be on the cover anymore after we said we didn't like that, you know? But they came back with another idea having to do with a teleprompter and words and such coming out of the president's mouth. That still didn't feel right. And ultimately they said, well, how about a picture of you at a typewriter? Did you ever write at a typewriter? I said, sure. When I got to the White House, I did. They said, good, with a picture, sort of campaign picture of Reagan in the background. And I said, gee, that's really wonderful. So they put us back on the cover. And it did get a lot of attention when the magazine came out, so that my editor, Peter Osnos, said, terrific, wonderful picture. That's the cover of the book.
Where was this picture taken?
In the studio of a photographer named Michael O'Neill, down in kind of the Soho area of New York.
And it's a picture that we've seen in so many places. Is this a picture that you had a chance to say, I like that? And if you did, what is it about the picture you like?
The times we took 1 million pictures like that sometimes with me in a different blouse. It was always the standard Reagan picture and the standard typewriter. I just looked different sometimes. They picked the final one at the Times, and we saw it once they'd chosen it. But we thought, well, that's a nice picture.
You like this?
Yeah, I think it's fine. Controversial in my family.
Why?
They just don't like the way I look, but I think it looks great.
Here is a review. This is the Washington Times, and this is a fellow.
I haven't seen that.
John Podhoretz, Norman Podhoretz's son. He also is an editor over at the Washington Times and writes a column. Writer for the Revolution is what he calls it, and they use the same picture again. White House intoxication fills Noonan's memoirs. I'm going to drop this, James, so that I can read to Peggy Noonan what the first paragraph says. Peggy Noonan's What I Saw at the Revolution, A Political Life in the Reagan Era is a classic. The single best book yet written on Washington during the Reagan era, and the only volume to come out of the Reagan White House that does the previous administration's triumphant strengths and appallingly petty weaknesses full justice.
Wow, that's
now, he was
wonderful.
a speechwriter in the Reagan administration. He does not know you. He said he's never met you, but he was there at times that you weren't there. What do you feel when somebody says something like this? And this was a card-carrying conservative.
Yeah, that's thrilling. Conservatives have, by and large, tended to be a little rough on the book, so I'm shocked to hear that. Oh, the book is arguably indiscreet, okay? It is a book that is very supportive of President Reagan, but at the same time, it is not, is it hagiography? Is that the word for Lives of the Saints? The art form known as A Life of the Saints? Okay. It doesn't portray him as a saint. He wasn't. He was a really terrific political leader. But I had some ambivalent feelings towards him. And I let them out, and sometimes I'm a little rough on him. And so that's one thing that's bothered them. Another thing that has bothered them is that I have written about, as a speechwriter, about writing speeches for Ronald Reagan. And there are some people who feel, I feel they are arguably correct, I just disagree with them, that you, first of all, as a speechwriter, you should never be out there and say that you wrote anything or ever write about the writing of it, but also you should pretend that the president didn't have speechwriters, that is our job, and I think that's silly, and I think once that was legitimate, and now it's just untenable, you know? So it didn't do no halo polishing, really, or if it does, maybe not quite enough. So,
on the other side of the political fence, and I want to be careful not to characterize Walter Shapiro as a liberal. I'm not sure he would agree with that. He used to write for the Washington Monthly, I believe, and he writes the, I think he did, he writes the review in this week's Time magazine. We'll just, here's a different photograph. Where'd this come from?
That's my apartment in New York. Time magazine sent over a photographer to take my picture a few weeks ago.
You like this?
Do I like the picture?
Is that you?
They're all goofy to varying extents, but I also like them all, you know? Yeah, that is me. You know, I guess there's a clue here, but after a while I started to think if they want a picture of me, it must be a good review. So constantly when they'd call and say, we need a picture for the review, I'd say yes, feeling that it was definitely a good review, because I'm not Gore Vidal and I'm not worth denouncing at length, and if you're going to denounce me, why have a picture of the hapless person you're being tough on? So, small clue to future authors, if they want you to take your picture, say yes, it's good news.
By the way, before I go on, I just wanted, can you believe all this is happening to you? All this publicity, all these reviews, all of this out front recognition. Is it what you wanted?
I can't, you know, there is a part of me, I said in the book that politicians tend to resist introspection and reflection. I'm not normally like that. I'm good at reflection. I like to sit around and just daydream and think about stuff. But I must say that recently, with all the hoo-ha over the book, there is a part of me that is just doing it and not reflecting it and not quite thinking about it because in a way I don't have time, and in a way it's a little too big for me. It's been a big thing. And sometimes I think I do handle things by not quite thinking about them at the moment.
Let me read what Walter Shapiro said in Time magazine. Perhaps Ted Sorensen, with his trademark verb-first, ask-not formulations, might rival Noonan as the best White House word crafter of the television age. But Sorensen writing for John Kennedy, or for that matter, Noonan composing soaring scripts for Reagan's second term, had it easy. Bush was an infinitely greater challenge. In writing his 1988 GOP convention address, Noonan miraculously transformed the Bush of the stumbling syntax and clotted catchphrases into a quiet leader, sensitive enough to glimpse 1,000 points of light, but strong enough to say flatly, read my lips, no new taxes. Now Noonan, who retired from politics with Bush's inaugural address, has written the funniest, most richly textured, nervously self-effacing, and deftly observed political memoir likely to come out of the 1980s. What's your reaction to that? This is a gentleman who is not of the same political persuasion, I suspect, as John Podhoretz. Basically,
I'm afraid I only have banal things to say. When I read that, I just thought, oh, that is just so great. Thanks, Walter. You know? It is, you know, I tried to write a serious book, and I wanted it to be a book that taught people things, you know? I wanted it to have weight. I wanted it to be dense, you know? In a way, I think you have no right to be boring, you know? Particularly if you're trying, a book is a form of aggression. You're aggressing and saying, hey, look at me, I can tell you something. I really have things I want to tell you, and it might be worthwhile listening, and if somebody says it was worthwhile listening, you feel, oh, that's wonderful. I just spent the last 3 years the right way, you know? So it's a delight.
it took 3 years to write?
Well, I signed the contract for it in '87, in the winter or spring of '87. Started writing it, but then soon after had a child. Took some time off after I had the baby. Started writing it again, but then got somewhat involved in the '88 campaign, and wound up by say the summer of '88 writing speeches in the morning and the book in the afternoon. And then as soon as Bush took the presidency, literally the first day of his presidency, the second day of his presidency, I went back to the book full time. And between then and August of, between late January and August of '89, I really got most of it done. It had been on my mind very much for 3 years.
Did you write the book differently than you wrote speeches? In other words, was your mind in a different mood when you wrote your book than when you, say, wrote a speech for George Bush?
Oh, yeah, I think so. You know, when I was, in the morning, when I was working on speeches for Bush, I was always going over notes of things that he had told me, And I was always trying very much to listen to resummon in my head the sound of his voice or the way he was using words when he told me something that I wrote down. So the morning was sort of trying to resummon him and keep him in my head. Then I'd go have lunch with my son, and in the afternoon I'd sort of try to shake it out and remember what it is that I think and how it is that I express myself. There was a part of me, you know, I've spent all of my professional life writing for other people, and they have mostly been men, rather Reagan and Bush. And there was a part of me that was a little bit afraid when I first decided to do the book and signed the contract to do it and got a deadline for it. There was a part of me that was afraid that I didn't really have my own sound anymore because I had so subsumed, in a way, my own sound in order to hear others. And I just, maybe this is a small point, but maybe not. I was just really afraid I couldn't get me back. And when the manuscript was done, I sent it to a few close friends, and they all told me, you know, we were afraid this might sound like Reagan, but it sounds like you. And I said, oh, does it really? And they said, yeah, it sounds like you at dinner, which is precisely the quality I wanted it to have, a conversation, you know, as if you were talking to someone you respect at a dinner table and telling them things. I forget what you asked me and why I'm off on this tangent.
Talked about, you know, when you wrote the book, whether or not you wrote, I mean, it was, you were writing it from your perspective rather than when you used to write speeches, if there was a difference.
Yeah, it was just trying, yeah.
How about physically? Where did you write it?
In two places, at a word processor at my home in Virginia, out in Virginia, in very like quasi-rural Virginia, out there by the Potomac. And then when I moved from there, I wrote the book in a big, leaky Victorian townhouse in Georgetown, a marvelous old place full of books that was owned by an elderly lady who was a liberal Democrat and who had worked apparently, from what I could see of her books, for Johnson in the 60s. I would open up her books at night when I was done writing about Reagan. I'd just pick at random a book, and I'd go through it, and out would flutter little leaflets in which the woman who owned the house had clearly written this essay answering Lyndon Johnson's conservative critics. And there was something so funny about that, you know, that I was in another, not just another writer's house, but a woman who was somewhat clearly obsessed with a time and a person, you know.
In the remarks of Walter Shapiro, when he talks about George Bush taking away the stumbling syntax and clotted catchphrases into a quiet, making him into a quiet leader, sensitive enough to glimpse 1,000 points of light, what should the public think about a president who needs a wordsmith putting words in his mouth that are something that he would not say if we were just having a conversation? What is it? Does this bother you at all?
Yeah, because it's, first of all, Bush, Vice President Bush, was never an inarticulate man. You have met him or seen him up close, I suspect. And in person, he's funny. I wouldn't call him voluble. He speaks in kind of gusts of speech. But he's kind of laid back and says funny and amusing things and interesting things, and is very chatty and anything but inarticulate. If you've ever received one of his notes or letters, you know he's anything but inarticulate. But I thought in '88, I thought part of the secret with Vice President Bush was that he was a little bit shy. He froze up a little bit when all of the cameras were on him and the red lights were on and the boom mic was 5 inches from his nose. So he sort of froze up a little bit. What I did for him, you can't make up words and stick them in his mouth. You know, it's not as if, oh, he's the hollow vessel, then handlers come along and fill him up. Bush was a man, a sophisticated, serious man who'd been in politics for a long time, who held serious beliefs. I think it is fair to say he hadn't quite caught his own voice by the time '88 had come, and by the time he really had to. And what I did for him at that time when I was working for him was a very simple thing. I just spent a lot of time with him and listened to him. Listen to what he wanted, listen to what his plans were, listen to what words were for him and humor was for him. When we worked on the acceptance speech, it was one of the things I like about remembering the acceptance speech is that it was the way things should be. It was a speechwriter working very closely with a principal. That is somewhat unusual these days. You know, in modern White Houses, in the Carter White House, Ford, the Reagan White House, there is now a greater separation between speechwriting, it's like a word factory, and the president, you know? Carter's speechwriter at a meeting at the Judson Welliver Society once told me, hey, the longest talk I ever had with Carter was the day I left. I found out in modern White Houses, they all don't see them that much. You read Sapphire's memoir of life with Nixon before the fall, and he said, as a speechwriter, he said, I was spun into the vortex and then spun out again. Spun in, very close to the president, and then out again. And when I read that, I thought, gee, just like it was for me, except I never got in. You know, it had changed even in 20 years, or 12 years, I guess. That is a trend to be discouraged. I think it ought to be like the old days, you know, when Judge Harry Rosenman and Robert Sherwood were actually really working with FDR, you know. One of these sub-themes of the book was to sort of quietly agitate to going back to the old ways, because there is too much separation. But in the acceptance speech, there was not that separation, and it was the way it should be, you know. And the reason it worked was not because it was, aha, we tricked you, we've made up this edifice called the New Bush. The reason that it worked, again, people are savvy and sophisticated, the people who are watching out there. They finally understood him because he finally showed who he was, you know? He found his voice, and he never lost it after that. He found his voice, and he could talk about what he was about, and that is why it was effective.
I've got another review here. Have you noticed that your friends or people that you're acquaintances with have changed their attitude about you as this publicity just gets more and more visible? People treating you differently today than they were, say, back in pre-October in the New York Times cover story?
Not friends. A lot of acquaintances are treating me a little differently. You know, people, I call people at business offices, friends of mine who are regular folks at business offices, and when I say my name now, people brighten up a little bit and go, sure, I'll get her. I think they actually, when they say they've left a message for a friend who isn't in, I think they really leave the message now. So little things like that happen, but nothing's changed with friends.
James Fallows wrote speeches for Jimmy Carter. He is the Atlantic Monthly, he was in Japan, I think he's back here now, did some NPR work. But here's a review in the Washington Monthly, February 1990. James, let's just let the audience see a little bit of what the headline looks on this. White House Confidential, the top speechwriter for Reagan and Bush takes you behind the scenes. I'll drop this so I can read the first paragraph. It says, Peggy Noonan is a terrific speechwriter, as she showed most convincingly with George Bush's acceptance speech, the Republican convention. Then he goes to the second page, and he's got some, let's see if he calls them criticisms. There are 3 significant problems with this book, which actually seem to be traits of character that came through in the writing. Have you read this?
No, but I've heard about it. I haven't read it, and I'm going to get it from you, and also the Washington Times one, but I have heard about it, so you're not taking me by surprise.
By the way, are you sensitive? I mean, do you find yourself,
yes.
huh?
Yes.
I mean, when you see when somebody,
much too much, yeah.
somebody whacks you over the head with one of these, it bothers you.
It's worse than that. I have that horrible Catholic sense of when anybody says anything bad about me, I can't think they're wrong. I think, oh, really? They don't know the half of it. You know, it really pierces my heart.
Now, let me try this one on. He says, first, even by the standards of Reagan-era memoirists and of speechwriters as a class, Noonan seems remarkably full of herself.
Oh, thank you, James. I'm sure he elaborates. Let me hear the elaboration.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you should get the next line. Life somehow has never taught her that if you can't be genuinely modest, even the semblance of modesty is a plus. She gives phrase-by-phrase accounts of how she drafted her speeches in a tone that would be appropriate for bar-by-bar recollections by Mozart. By the way, this is a fairly positive review, but this is obviously not a positive.
No, that was actually, that was sort of described to me as a kind of rough one, is it not?
Yeah,
there's some maybe rough because it's well argued, unfortunately.
We'll just take that. That statement kind of jumped out the page. What do you think of that one?
Well, I don't know. You know, I got Maybe I have too robust an ego and it shone right through, or it shined right through. But you know, I take joy in writing and joy in work. I actually believe in highfalutin things like the sanctity of work. There's even redemption in it. And when I was writing about speeches and how they were put together and what my thoughts were and what input I got, if I wrote with too great, maybe a robust self-enjoyment, well, there you are. But I didn't think of it as self-enjoyment. I thought of it as excitement about and love for the work, you know? So there you are. That's the best I could do. I can't say that's an illegitimate criticism. It's just, I hope he's wrong. I don't see it his way.
There's more to that, of course. Yeah. But second, there is a peculiar class dynamic underway in the book. I'm going to jump on here. But in this book, she hauls out her working class credentials so often and so showily that she seems to be using them to mau the nice young men in blue suits from Brooks she fought against in the White House. They couldn't possibly understand the emotions of real America, she would tell them, because unlike her, they weren't from Brooklyn and hadn't ever worked in a diner. There's something to this point, but not as much as Noonan makes of it. When she's not talking about her humble roots, Noonan drops allusions to the world of academics and aesthetics and the deconstructionalists, Gerald Murphy, that seem a little far-fetched. I could be reading it wrong, but it looks as if she's using these signals to show that she has it both ways. She's a woman of the people, but she knows as much as the pointy heads.
Well, James, what's the meaning of that? You know, if you were a waitress, should you not know who Proust was? You know? Does it prove you were a waitress if you don't know about Ezra Pound? That's not as good a point, I think. I don't think that's as good as the first one.
The last one isn't really criticism. I mean, it says, finally there's, well, it may be criticism, but it's not the same kind. Finally, there's the question of writing for the ear. Before she joined the Reagan staff, Noonan had spent several years as a writer for Dan Rather. Her specialty was scripts for his 5-minute radio commentaries. She presents it as a kind of a delicious irony that she could have spanned the gulf between Rather and Reagan. But by the time a reader finishes this book, the irony or mystery will have disappeared. In both jobs, Noonan was doing essentially the same thing, writing words that would be listened to rather than read on a page. Probably without meaning to, she uses the same approach in much of this book, and in so doing, she demonstrates that the way she writes matters more than what she says.
Well, I don't know what to say about that. I think that's kind of interesting, actually. I have been writing for the ear since the time I got out of college and got my first job in broadcasting. And I've been writing for the ear so long that when I was writing a book, which you do not read with your ear, I still found myself saying every sentence aloud and seeing if it had the right rhythm or just sounded just the way I wanted it to sound. And I don't know if that was a plus or a minus for the literature of the book. But I must tell you, it's the way I do it now. And that's probably not going to stop. It's partly writing for the ear, but partly maybe some kind of love for conversation. I love what I hear. I love the rhythm of human speech. But that's not what he means. But maybe it is written for the ear. I don't know.
A couple more here. The New York Times, Wilfred Sheed. You've undoubtedly seen this one.
Yeah.
It was the lead again. The lead book review in the Sunday Times. Was that something you were hoping for? And when it came, what was your reaction to it?
I knew about it in advance, and we knew about a week before. They're printed up like 10 days before. I hadn't known that until recently, but I got that a week before everybody else did. It was thrilling. It was wonderful. My fantasy had been page 3. You know, my fantasies are always kind of grounded in reality. My feeling is, I don't know, how many books do we put out in America? 50,000? Don't hope.
3,000 a month, at least.
3,000 a month? Okay, don't hope for the front page of the New York Times Book Review. That's not going to happen. But if you're lucky and the book is good, you could be page 3. So.
Well, let me stop at this point and ask you, what of all these things, you mentioned earlier when we started that the New York Times Magazine cover story probably did more than anything else to make the book. Why,
I think so.
Why is it that powerful?
I think it is a magazine that is taken seriously. It's not a frivolous magazine. It's taken seriously by thinking people, and the particular chapter that the Times took from the manuscript and ran in the magazine was a funny chapter about sort of being a little bumptious, a little clumsy in the White House, but also about how exciting it is to be in the White House and how exciting it is to write there. So that it kind of captured, I think, people's imagination. I almost gather that people were a little bit surprised that a conservative would come out of a White House and be funny or make them laugh, you know? And I think that helped it, that the Times happened to pick a chapter that was funny as opposed to a chapter that was serious. Mirabella magazine, the fashion magazine, picked a very serious chapter. Everybody plays against type, I guess.
Well, what are you going to do with all this? I mean, you've got a ride in publicity that, you know, if you scripted it, it couldn't have been any more than it is probably. Have you missed anything in this? Is there anything you want to do that you haven't done in the publicity
book
part
tour?
of this? Yeah.
No. Like what?
I don't know what's missing. I mean, I guess the 60 Minutes interviews. And you start.
Oh, yes. It hasn't. Look, it hasn't been that extraordinary. There's no 60 Minutes interviews or stuff like that. But it's gotten more attention than a book usually gets.
Is it selling?
Yeah, it is. The actual publication date is February 28th, but still, it's the.
What does that mean?
Well, in this case, it means nothing. It means very little. A publication date is supposed to mean something. It means reviewers are supposed to plan their reviews around the pub date, or like a week before, a week after. But again, the New York Times thing so accelerated the process that I think by November and December, people thought they'd already read the book. I actually, in New York, met a woman at a cocktail party who assured me in December that she'd bought it in a bookstore, and it was still in galleys. And she loved it. She was very complimentary about it. But at any rate, the pub date, which normally means something, and it doesn't in this case mean anything, is February 28th, and the book hasn't been in the bookstores for very long, really for about 10 days. And it's doing very well, at least in Washington and New York, which I think are the only two cities that Random House is tracking.
What I really was starting to ask you was, what are you going to do next? I mean, what after you've had all this publicity, all this visibility, what's next for Peggy Noonan's career?
Well, I'm going to do something maybe a little bit surprising. I'm going to stay home and write a novel. A novel that is going to be based in New York, will not be overtly political, although because I'm writing it, it'll certainly be implicitly political here and there.
Where's home now?
New York City. Be based in New York. I don't know quite what it's about, but I know it will deal with the very rich and the changing nature of wealth, and the very poor and the changing nature of poverty. And I know it involves a child living in the most dysfunctional heart of that at least somewhat dysfunctional city. I'm really fascinated by the horrid Gin Lane-like conditions under which some children in New York are growing up. So I'm going to do that. I'm not going to do some of the maybe more predictable things. I don't want to do a column. I have decided that. Or commentary and stuff like that. I want to stay home and be a serious writer. I'm going to write some for TV too. Still try to be a serious writer in TV.
And you've still got a young...
Yeah, I do. I have a boy who's 2.5, and he's growing quickly. He's going to leave me soon and go to school. And in New York, when they go to school, they leave at 8 in the morning, and then between lessons and scheduled play dates, you don't see them again till 4 or 5 p.m. when they come in with their little briefcase, you know? So if that's going to happen in 3 years, I want to spend the next 3 years at home where he is, and that'll be good for him and good for me.
Why did you choose to go back to New York?
Friends and family are there. It's where I'm from. My marriage had ended. I had been living in Virginia with my husband. When we separated, I went and lived in Washington for a while and had to decide really where I was going to go and spend the rest of my life. And Washington, though a fine place, and a place that in many ways did win my heart, was not it. And I must tell you, all the 5 years I was in Washington, I really missed New York. I even held on to my rent-stabilized apartment for 3 years, my first 3 years when I was down here, when I couldn't even afford it, just because I didn't want to lose that little bit of me being up there. So I decided to to move back up, and packed up a Ryder truck over Labor Day weekend with my mom and my son, and moved on up. And I can't imagine really living outside that area. You know, maybe New Jersey or Connecticut, but that'll be my place, I think, for the rest of my life.
Wilfred Sheeds, just one thing I wanted to ask you about. He says, which brings us at long last. It's interesting to watch these reviewers when they're 4 paragraphs before they get to the book.
Yeah.
At long last, to Peggy Noonan. Lengthy preambles are a pest, but justified in her case because Ms. Noonan places herself firmly, not to say hauntingly, in her situation, such that when she says this is where I stand, she means a specific time and place. What about this criticism about lengthy preambles are a pest? He says it's okay, but did you on purpose write lengthy preambles?
I thought he was referring to his preamble.
Oh, he must be. You got me
I think he was, yeah. And I think he was just sort of charmingly eliding from his preamble into what he wanted to say. I think they actually, I understand it was a lengthier preamble, but they cut it on him at the Times because they wanted to get the name of the book on the front page, for which I certainly thank them.
You're
although
right.
he may
As a
not.
matter of fact, when I read it, I couldn't figure out what he was saying.
Oh, that's what he was referring to.
Ms. Noonan might further be described as a strict reactionary like her boss, driven rightward by the sheer obnoxiousness of the left.
Yeah, and he uses a funny example. He compares Ronald Reagan continually talking about how he got to know the communists when he was head of the Screen Actors Guild. He compares Reagan talking about that with my talking about what it was like in the early 70s to be going to anti-war demonstrations in Washington and to be surrounded by people who were saying awful things about America, which is a moment I recount in the book, and which people always ask me how I became a conservative, and you know, I can never quite answer that question, but I always can tell them when I knew I was not of the left. And I knew I was not of the left when I was on that bus hurtling down the Jersey Turnpike on its way down to Washington for this big demonstration, and these people were saying awful. You remember the standard litany of insults about America, and I didn't see it that way. And that's when I sort of started to part from the Democratic Party and from what was at that point, what was becoming modern liberalism, I guess.
You think your views today are rock solid? Have they changed at all in the last couple of years?
I have not changed a bit in the past few years about the essentials, one essential being communism. Another essential being, look, you want government, as Reagan would say, to be smaller, not bigger, and you want taxes to be lower, not higher. I can't say that I've changed about any of that. I think I've changed some approaches. My feeling on abortion, as I go into in the book, I'm as anti-abortion. You know, 20 years ago I wasn't anti-abortion, but changed somewhat in the 70s and early 80s. And I have sort of changed strategically on that. I used to just think, yes, let's get a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. And now I think really that we sort of have to change our strategy, that the Republican Party is the anti-abortion party, but Republicans do a funny thing. Abortion is such an opposition creator as a subject that they hate to talk about it. They talk about it very little. They talk about why they oppose it very little, but once a year they trot out this unpopular amendment which goes nowhere, you know? And I think we have it backwards, and we really ought to talk more and talk about why we are the anti-abortion party and why we are opposed to abortion, and then move legislatively. So that's a change in strategy or tactics. I forget which word is the right one. But still on abortion itself, I haven't changed. I don't think, you know, I think you sort of, by the time you're in your mid-30s, you have your political views. And you may change a little at the margins, but essentially you believe what you believe. You're a fully formed adult. And if you are, you're probably not going to go off. You're probably not going to discover at age 42 that Maoism is the answer. You know?
In your book, let's see where I can get a copy of this thing here so that the audience can see what it looks like. We haven't shown it for a while. In your book, there are no pictures other than this picture on the cover.
Yeah.
How come?
That's probably a mistake. We just never thought in terms of pictures because it wasn't a history and it wasn't your basic was you there, Charlie, sort of White House memoir. it sort of wasn't linear. I'm not even sure what I mean by that, but it was, maybe I was thinking I was attempting to make the book literature, and pictures didn't seem right. But you know, people love to look at pictures, and people continually ask me why we didn't have them, and so maybe we should have.
And this picture is of your son Will and you?
That's Willie, yeah.
And it's in the New York Times Review. Who took this, and why did you have this picture? Why'd you let him have this picture?
Well, it was a little impromptu. It's Sam Wilson or Jim Wilson. I think it is Sam Wilson, a staff photographer for the New York Times, came over to my house. Times called and said, we're running a review of your book on such and such a date. Can we have a picture? Now, that's not unusual. The Times will do that with maybe 3 books a week. When the photographer was there, my son woke up from his nap, and I went in and got him and brought him out. And he looked at the camera, and the photographer said, can I take a picture? And I thought about it for a second, and I said, yeah. I must tell you, figuring they wouldn't use it, but frequently photographers send you their leftovers, you know, that they don't use, and I'd get a beautiful professional photograph of me and Will. We were all quite surprised when they used it, but I thought it was okay. Maybe because I like to look at my son.
What does your son think of all this?
Oh, well, he's funny. You know, he's 2½, and the 2½-year-old mind is just a hoot. He's gotten used to seeing me in magazines now. There's been a lot of magazine publicity about the book. So when he sees a magazine now, he brings it to me and says, Mommy, like, Mom, what page are you on, 47? He also thinks, he's heard enough about the book so that he thinks, he knows what a book is because they're on the bookshelves. He thinks now that I've written all books. Do you know what I mean? All of the books on our bookshelf and all books in general. He feels that's what I've done, write the books.
One more.
He brings them to
Actually,
me.
we've got 2 more. We've got time. One is the Washington Post, and this is a fellow by the name of Reed Bedeau, or Bedeau.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
He's an assistant editor of Book World, putting words in the president's mouth. He says it's an engaging book, the story of how a plucky and talented young person literally wrote her way into a previously all-male domain. Is that true, and why is it? And by the way, this is an illustration that the Washington Post has done. Why is it an all-male domain?
I think only because politics has been largely an all-male business, you know? Maybe also because young women who wanted to write in my generation maybe mostly went into various kinds of journalism and reporting. It's almost an odd tick to want to write for other people as I did, you know, and to want to write not only for other people but to write politically, you know. So that limits the number of people who'd go into the speechwriting biz anyway. Most speechwriters do come from sort of the bowels of the campaign, you know. They were a press kid on the, you know, one of the press office kids on the campaign plane. Or, you know, they put in their time working for the political director of the campaign as an assistant. And speechwriting, I think, is given as a sort of, as a job, you know, sometimes as a plum, as a reward. Campaigns are mostly male, so if you're bringing guys from a campaign into a White House, you're going to have mostly male speechwriters. I notice in the past few White Houses, there's always been one woman speechwriter. Maury Mossing was the woman speechwriter before me. There was a wonderful Carter speechwriter whose name I cannot remember, but she was the only Carter speechwriter who was a woman. There was a Ford speechwriter who was a woman, so there always seems to be one.
All right, last review. Dave Shiflett, who was he's now the deputy editorial page editor of the Rocky Mountain News. This is in the Wall Street Journal. He used to work for the Washington Times. This is one paragraph I want to ask you. I'm sure you've seen this one.
I have seen that one.
He says he didn't really want to give you a good review, but he's going to give you a good review anyway. But he says the fact is, Peg. Anybody call you Peg?
No.
And did you like that?
No. I thought it odd. I couldn't help but think, Dave, would you have done that to a boy, Dave? I may be wrong to ask that question, but it did cross my mind.
The fact is, Peg was one of the few people wearing pants at the White House. She was a raw meat gal.
You know, there's something, that review was kind of schizophrenic, I thought. It was a generally approving and supportive review written in a nasty, snide tone. I have never seen such a review in my life.
Do you know this man?
He says I took him to lunch once.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't remember it, but a fellow named Phil Nicolaides, who I worked with at the White House, called me after this review and said, Peggy, I feel so sorry about this, but I'm the reason you took that guy to lunch. He said, I know him, and I walked by your office one day, and you said, come on over to the mess, we'll have lunch together. And he said it was my fault. So I told him I'd forgive him someday, but not soon.
He does end it, though, and back to what we talked about earlier. Unfortunately, the book ends with her moving to New York.
Yeah.
What do you think someone would say, unfortunately? Is there a bias in this town against New York?
Oh, well, understandably, I think Washington thinks New York is not America, and Washington is right, New York isn't. New York is an island off the continent. In New York, of course, they think Washington is not America. Washington is an odd, gray company town. That also is true. Maybe they have biases against each other to an extent. But then again, everybody on the shuttle is jolly every day, so there you are.
Will your book have any impact, and we've just got a few minutes left, you think, on what White Houses think about speechwriters, and do they worry? Did you take notes while you were there?
Oh, yes, very much so. When I first joined the White House, William Safire, the old Nixon hand, speechwriter, took me aside and said, keep notes every day. And I said, oh, working so hard, I don't have time. He said, no, every day, even if it's a sentence, write it down, put it in the bottom left-hand drawer of your desk. Sooner or later, you're going to have something. I can't say I did it every day, but I did it a lot. It was very good advice.
Is there a lot in this book from those notes?
Oh, yes, very much so. I had whole files full of notes. I kept a diary. I did all that stuff, kept notes on everything the president had ever said to me, sometimes written on napkins, literally, because it was what I had around when he was on the phone. I hope that changes the position of the speechwriter in politics, I'll tell you. That would be important. At the very least, I hope it convinces campaign aides that if they're not good, someone may write about them. You know?
Is there anybody that you know of in the Bush White House that is keeping notes and plans to write a book someday?
At least half of the Bush White House is keeping notes. I know that without having asked, you know? I don't know of anyone who wants to write a book or who has thought about it, but I can imagine a number who would.
What I Saw at the Revolution is the title of the book, and the author, Peggy Noonan, our guest for the last hour. Thank you very much for spending this time with us.
Thank you, Brian. This was fun. I appreciate it.